milieu as well. So I'd like to invite now Professor Jean-Louis Ska to present here tonight a Catholic perspective on the biblical interpretation.
So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to come up from the Biblicum to the Gregorian University and to participate in this very interesting panel about different kinds of exegesis. So as you noticed, I won't speak Dante's language, but some kind of South Belgium Shakespearean dialect. So the title of my short intervention is this: The Two Souls of Catholic Exegesis. Catholic exegesis has two souls. This statement may startle, but I will try to buttress this in this short intervention in memory of Cardinal Augustin Bea, who was rector of the Pontifical Biblical Institute. He is probably more known and celebrated for his work in Jewish-Christian relationships than for his exegetical insights. We'll come back to this later. Which are these two souls? I would say, in a few words, that the one soul is that of Augustine of Hippo, and the other that of Origen. Or we may even say that Origen had himself two exegetical souls, since he was, on the one side, a promoter of the allegorical reading of the scriptures, and on the other, the founder of text criticism, for instance, in his letter to Africanus and his Exapla, and of biblical criticism in some chapters of his De Principiis Peri Archon. Even Augustine may have shown signs of a double personality in his De Doctrina Christiana, since he encourages to find in the Bible the revelation of the Trinity. But he also recommends studying the original languages and to read works of literature and history to deepen one's understanding of the inspired texts. The first soul can be characterized by five main features. First, the first one is a strong interest for theology and an insistence, therefore, on inspiration, on the divine origin of the scriptures, on its unicity and incomparability. There is an unbridgeable gap between the inspired scriptures on the one side and all other kinds of literature on the other side. Second, this soul is not very much interested in history, in the cultural milieu in which scriptures were composed and in their original audiences. Exegetes of this first group pay little attention to textual criticism, to the different phases of text redaction, or to the development of biblical literature. The idea of evolution does not attract very much these exegetes unless one speaks of the relationship between Old and New Testament. In a few words, their exegesis is more synchronic than diachronic. Third, both testaments are read as a unity in saying the fulfillment of the Old in the New. Fourth, the exegetes of this kind also prefer to interpret the text in a community of faith, in the church, in a spirit of faith, and according to the very spirit that inspired the scriptures. Fifth, comparison with other literatures is not much popular, except when it is possible to show the superiority of the biblical inspired text over against other cultures, or to find arguments on behalf of the truth of the Bible. One could add that this exegetical soul often focuses the analysis on the letter, the grammar, the vocabulary, and the style of the text, and passes almost immediately to its message, its theological content. Little attention is paid to mediations, for instance, to the different literary genres of a given passage or the changes that may have occurred during the composition and the transmission of the text. The text is read pro jacet, as it stands, in its canonical shape. The second soul is probably less popular, at least in certain circles. Here again, let me list 5 characteristics. First, to say it with Rabbi Ishmael, who was already quoted, the exegetes of the second tendency affirm that the Torah speaks in the language of man. So it means the whole Bible speaks a human language, which means that it follows the rules of human languages and must be interpreted according to the rules of every human language. This was contested, obviously, by another school, that of Rabbi Akiba, who contended that every detail, every single variation within the Torah is meaningful. Second, focusing on the human side of the Bible, the exegetes of the second tendency inquire about the authors or the writers of the text, its origin, its original audience, and interpret it within its culture, the mentality and the lyric conventions of the time. Third, they are also sensitive to the diversity of the text and their evolution. If for the exegetes of the first category, the text is unified, and there are but a few secondary tensions and no real contradictions within the whole Bible, for the exegetes of this second group, there are gaps, tensions, contradictions, indeterminations, and even errors from a human point of view in certain texts. Fourth, comparison with texts and artifacts from other cultures in ancient Near East are daily bread on the tables of these exegetes. They underline the similarities and do not hesitate to show that the Bible borrowed many ideas, images, literary conventions, and even theological representations from the neighboring cultures. Israel was not isolated. On the contrary, Israel was in constant contact with other cultures such as Phoenicia, Syria, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. Fifth, there is much variety in the text, and one speaks very easily in these circles of the polyphony of the Bible. One underscores the value of individual books, individual pericopes, of individual schools or movements, and there is no reluctance to admit the evolution from early to more sophisticated forms within the same literary family of texts. There is no hesitancy to admit the imperfection and the limits of some parts of scriptures. Not everything is perfect, and not everything is perfect in the same way in Holy Scriptures. As every human work, the Bible bears the marks of human limitations and deficiencies. This kind of exegesis is more diachronic than synchronic, and moreover uses many tools in its interpretation of the text, as for instance grammar, linguistics, history, archaeology, studies in comparative religions, and all the resources coming from comparison with ancient Near Eastern cultures and literatures. Of course, some will say that it is not easy or even impossible to classify all Catholic exegetes with the help of those 2 categories. As I just said, those are 2 souls, and several exegetes may find their inspiration in both souls in one way or the other, and everyone in a different way. There is a point, however, that I would like to underline, namely that there is surely a predilection in many Catholic circles for the first soul, more attuned to the traditional theology of the believers. Moreover, there were many conflicts and even some dramatic events in the recent and less recent history of the Catholic Church. In this short paper, let me mention only some of them. The relation between the different kinds of exegesis within the Catholic Church changed drastically with Pius XII, Pope from 1939 till 1958. But for fortuitous reasons, in 1941, an Italian priest, Dain Coenel, it was a nickname, and his real name is Dolindo Ruotolo, attacked publicly in a highly polemical fashion the scientific and critical exegesis of the Pontifical Biblical Institute, especially that of the French Jesuit father Stanislas Lyonnais, who often spoke of literary genres. He favored instead, Ruotolo favored instead an allegorical and spiritual exegesis close to that of some fathers of the Church. What mattered, of course, is that he attacked a pontifical institution and challenged, therefore, the authority of the Pope, the latter, whose confessor was no less than Augustin Bea, rector of the Biblicum, felt that he had to react. He published, therefore, the encyclical Divino Afflante Spiritu in 43, 50 years after Leo XIII Provindentissimus. This encyclical letter rehearses some well-known tenets of Catholic exegesis, for instance, the importance of the magisterium, the authority of the Church in biblical matters, and the presence in the scriptures of both a literal and a spiritual meanings. But it defended also the legitimacy of a scientific and critical study of biblical text on behalf of the École Biblique and the Pontifical Biblical Institute, École Biblique of Jerusalem, insisting on the necessity of learning ancient languages, underscoring the importance of the author's intention and the necessity of establishing more rigor, with rigor the literal meaning before speaking of the spiritual sense of scriptures. The historical critical method is necessary to determine the author's intention, and therefore what is the inspired and theological meaning of the text. The two souls of Catholic exegesis are present side by side in this encyclical, with an attempt to define more clearly their relationship. The reconciliation between the two camps was not yet complete, however. To illustrate this in a lighter way, let me tell an anecdote. Father Ignace de la Poterie, another exegete who had surely at least two exegetical souls, used to say that the word spirit appears only in the first sentence of the encyclical, unfortunately. This document does not speak sufficiently of a spiritual reading of the scriptures, as for instance in patristic exegesis. Another teacher of the Biblical Institute retorted with this yarn: what is spirit for Father de la Poterie? Spirit for him is like intuition for other people. This is what enables him to be right even when he is wrong. You have understood, I am sure, to which school both of these members of the Biblical belonged. So, I have 5 minutes. So before the Second Vatican Council, the situation was very tense. There were two schools again, and two teachers of the Biblicum were condemned, were prevented from teaching, Lyonnais, Cervic, and one in Frankfurt, Schierse. The situation was serious and very tense, but a joke will illustrate the atmosphere better than a long exposition. Two cardinals arrive at Stazione Termini just before one session of the Second Vatican Council. They take a cab until St. Peter's Square. They have to discuss delicate topics, and for this reason, they talk in Latin with each other. When they arrive at St. Peter's Square, they ask the taxi driver for the fare. And he answered in Latin. They were baffled and dumbfounded. The driver had understood the whole conversation. After a short while, one of the cardinals recovered and shyly asked the driver, "Sir, how does it come that you know Latin? Roman taxi drivers usually do not even speak Italian. They speak Romanesco." The taxi driver smiled, put a hand on his mouth, and muttered, "Yes, Eminence, you know, before becoming a taxi driver, I was teaching at the Pontifical Biblical Institute." So let me add one sentence. If you meet a taxi driver in the coming days, speaking Italian with a slight French accent, you will understand what happened after this conference. So I have, one paragraph, yes. The two souls of Catholic exegesis could live in peace, apparently, after the Second Vatican Council and Dei Verbum, although conflicts and tensions were not excluded. Let me finish with a short note. In 1993, 100 years after the encyclical Provenditissimus of Leo XIII, and 50 years after the encyclical Divino Afflante Spiritu, the Biblical Commission, whose secretary at that time was Father Albert Vanois, the Biblical, published a document entitled Interpretation of the Bible in the Church. On the one hand, this document is a milestone, since it admits a plurality of methods and condemns only the fundamentalist reading of the scriptures. It also gives pride of place to the historical critical method. There is no conflict anymore, it seems, at least, but a polyphony, a concert of different instruments and voices. On the other hand, there are two forewords to this document. The first bears the signature of Pope John Paul II and was written by the actual Cardinal Albert Vanois, secretary of the Commission at that time. The second bears the signature of the then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger and future Benedict XVI, president of the Biblical Commission and of the Congregation of Faith at that time. According to me, the music heard in these two forewords is not exactly the same. There are two souls in Catholic biblical exegesis. It was the case yesterday, and it is still the case today. Thank you very much.
I would like to ask Professor Ska if he might have any recommendations on how we can keep the two souls of Catholic biblical interpretation in a balance doing biblical exegesis today.
That's what you get.
Of course.
My answer is very short. The problem is this. Do we do exegesis, yes or no? The rules of exegesis are the rules of exegesis. That's it.